Ruth, thank you very much for the introduction, your generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see people in person. I was telling Clara, I haven't done a real in-person conference in years, which is so it's very nice to see you all, and I'm looking forward to 3 days and getting to talk philosophy in person with people. A slightly awkward position of being both a host and a guest. So as host, let me just say welcome. Thank you for making the travel. Thanks for taking the time to be here. We're very excited. As guest, let me thank Ruth and Clara, and there's a team here that's running around taking care of everything. They're amazing, and just thanks to everybody for making this possible. Try not to be too loud. Okay, so it's already a little late, so I'm going to dive right in. My son this morning told me the talk was too long. I said, "You don't know how long it is." He said, "How many slides?" I said, "Maybe 30. Too long." So I'll jump right in. I'm going to give you a spoiler version of the talk to begin with. So my main thought with Du Châtelet on space was, when you go into it, or at least when I went into it, I thought really natural reading of what's going to happen here is she's going to size up Newton and Leibniz, criticize Newton, and more or less side with Leibniz. And I don't think that is entirely wrong, but what I'm going to try to suggest today in the talk is that that's not really the best way to think about it. That really what Du Châtelet is working with is an older distinction between what I'm going to call a spatial metaphysics and a spaceless metaphysics. And that once we get the right sort of frame in place, her text starts making more sense, and we get a sort of an interesting picture of what she's on about with space. And I don't know exactly where people are in their thinking about her on space, like in the way that I am maybe with Leibniz or something like that. So I'm very interested to see what you all think. Okay. The talk's going to have 4 parts. First, I'm going to introduce some background on space and set up 2 dichotomies. Then the second part, I'm going to suggest that getting the right dichotomy in place helps clear up some puzzles. And then the third section, I'm going to suggest that in 10 sections near the end, what Du Châtelet is doing is offering an air theory for spatial metaphysics. And in the last 6 sections of her chapter on space, what she's doing is beginning to start on a response to a sort of indispensability argument that we get from Newton for spatial metaphysics. So that's the plan for the talk, and we can start on the first part. I'm a little wet sticking there. What's that? What's that? Oh, I got it. Oh, no problem. Well, okay. All right, so I think the philosophy of space in the first half of the 18th century is still a 3-horse race. One view is what I'm going to call a spaceless view. And we know this may be most familiar from Descartes, but is also a view shared by Aristotle and the scholastics. So Descartes, for example, holds that the whole essence of matter is extension. And he thinks it follows from that idea of an immaterial space is going to be incoherent. It would be something that's extended and therefore material, and yet immaterial. That view, if you teach it in class, that view is usually surprising to people. But it's actually a view that has a long, long history. Aristotle holds essentially the same view. So, for example, he gives an argument where he says, there couldn't be a 3-dimensional space, because if you put a body in it, you would have, the 3-dimensional space would have to be extended. It would have a property. It would have to be the property of a substance. So then you'd have 2 bodies, 2 substances in the same place at the same time. But the underlying thought is that if there's something extended, it's got to be a substance. It can't be an immaterial thing. It's got to be a body. Spaceless folks, so what I'm suggesting is there's one view on the floor is there is no space. Space doesn't make any sense. There isn't anything at all like that. Those people knew they were committed to the plenum. And so they defended the plenum. Aristotle leans into this idea. One sort of argument, maybe the most famous sorts of arguments he gives, he argues that if there were a vacuum, then motion in the vacuum would be infinitely fast. And he thinks that's absurd. He's thinking like bodies are slowed down by the resistance. If there's a void, there'd be no resistance, so bodies would move infinitely fast. He gives another sort of less famous argument, but I think is intriguing. He argues that if there were a void, heavy bodies and light bodies would fall at the same rate, which he takes to be an absurdity that, of course, we accept today. Descartes builds his cosmology and optics around the thought that the world's a plenum. We have the planets moving around in a vortex of fluid, or finely divided body. Optics is like a pressure wave moving out that presupposes a plenum as well. The spaceless folks, of course, felt comfortable denying the existence of space because they thought you didn't need it anyway. Right? So we have spaceless folks. They know they're committed to the plenum. They defend the plenum. Third thought is that they don't see why you would want space. Aristotle, for example, argues explicitly that space would be superfluous. And his thought, I think you can get into the swing of his thought. I think maybe Du Châtelet has the same thought. He says, look, take a wooden cube. Right? Take away its properties. Its color, its smell, whatever. You're going to be left with a three-dimensional extended thing. A body that's just extended. What would you want space for? What more than that would you need? Like if you want something that's a void, just have a body that's extended. Descartes, I think, is in some ways more systematic. But he also thinks you just don't need space. So he thinks, look, you can define place without space. You can define place in terms of other bodies. You can define motion in terms of place. So you can define motion without space as well. And you can account for qualitative variety in terms of motion. So you can explain, for example, or he thinks you can ground at least the differences between dense bodies and non-dense bodies without making any appeals to space at all. So the upshot is that for folks like Descartes, and really throughout the Middle Ages, all the way back to Aristotle, you've got this tradition that says space isn't possible, the void is necessary, and none of this is like needed anyway. Space isn't just impossible, it's odious. There's no reason to want it. Against the spaceless view, Newton, it doesn't start with Newton, but Newton defends the postulation of the void on explanatory grounds. So he cites with approval Boyle's work on air pumps. He argues that vacua are needed to account for relative densities. He thinks without a vacua, all bodies would have the same density. He argues that the motions of the planets and the comets would stop in this, I call it the starry sky, because one of the problems with talking about space is to how to talk about these things without begging the question against your opponents. But he thinks if there was a plenum in the world, he thinks the planets and the stars would be impossibly retarded. In Query 828 of the Optics, he concludes, to make way for the regular and lasting motions of the planets and comets, it is necessary to empty the heavens of all matter. So that's Newton defending the void. Now, Newton, of course, didn't only defend the void, he championed a specific understanding of what space was. Lots of details we could talk about there, but I think 3 points will be sufficient for our purposes. So he thinks space exists in the world independently of bodies. That is, space doesn't depend for its existence on bodies. Maybe the other way is a little more complicated. Space has properties of its own. It's three-dimensional, of course, but it's also immobile, indivisible, penetrable, homogeneous, continuous, and infinite. Finally, he's got a picture of how bodies relate to space. Bodies co-locate with regions of space, and when they move, they co-locate with successively different regions of space. So it's a nice picture. Early in his career, Leibniz adopts pretty much the same view. He holds a very similar view as far as we can tell. He even agrees with Newton that space is grounded, he says space is grounded in divine immensity, which is something that later comes up in the Clark correspondence. Leibniz, as far as I know, never denies that space is grounded in divine immensity. By the late 1680s, however, at the latest, this is currently a hot topic of debate in very small circles. By the 1680s, maybe after he clandestinely reads the Principia, he has a new view of space. And it's a new, unprecedented view of space. For Leibniz, for the mature Leibniz, I'll just drop the early view from now on. He thinks space is relationally defined, modal, and abstract. By relationally defined, I mean, he thinks that locations or situations are mutually defined in relation to one another. So here's an analogy. He thinks the location of the king in a game of chess, is defined by the position of the king, or situation is defined by the situation of the queen, or in relationship to the situation of the queen, in relationship to the situation of the bishop, in relationship to the other positions of the other pieces. And the position of the queen is in turn defined in terms of the relations it bears to the position of the king, the bishop, the knight, etc. So each position of those things is defined in terms of the positions of the other. There's subtleties there we could think more about, but not at first pass, not in terms of the chessboard itself. And Leibniz gives a nice example where he says there's two people on horseback playing chess. It's like, you don't need the chessboard. There's some details there that could get tricky, but that's good enough for now. It's modal, I think really in two senses. In one sense, it's modal in that the structure itself, he thinks is necessary. So that is really, the short version is he thinks it's got the structure of Euclidean geometry. He thinks Euclidean geometry is necessary. Leibniz does sort of play around with some things that you might think, oh, wait a minute. But really, I think you can put yourself back in the position, like, the necessity of Euclidean space is really good. Take a lot to turn that over. But it's not just necessary in that, it's not just modal in that sense. It's also modal in the sense that it covers not just all actual positions, it covers all possible positions. So it doesn't just define where the actual things are, it defines them where everything could be. And finally, it's abstract. It's an ideal structure. And he thinks, as the Christian Platonist that he is, he thinks it exists in the divine intellect. When a body moves for Leibniz, its position relative to other bodies changes. But space itself doesn't change. It's not the relational positions of the things change, but space is that abstract structure that's permanent and immutable. Okay, so the views of Descartes, Newton, and Leibniz, they sort of naturally divide out into two different dichotomies. One dichotomy I'm going to call the spaceless versus spatial dichotomy. It separates Descartes on the one hand, as well as Aristotle, the scholastics, everybody up really through up to the Renaissance, from Newton, but also from Leibniz, as well as More, Gassendi, Patrizzi, and the ancient atomists. That's one dichotomy. It's really a spatial view versus a spaceless view. The second dichotomy is maybe more familiar for us today, the difference between Newtonian substantivalism and Leibnizian relationalism. That really separates Newton from Leibniz. The first dichotomy asks, does space exist at all? Is there space at all or isn't there? Is there a void or isn't there? The second dichotomy separates a question that's really an in-house debate among spatial folks. It asks, what's the nature of space? Is it more like a container, more like an extended attribute that things co-locate with? Or is it more like a structure where things have relationally defined positions? Right? So that's the two dichotomies I want to get on the table. Okay? I'll give you a second. I hope that's all right. Okay. All right, so with a clearer picture of the landscape, then I think we're ready for our next part. Okay. So near the beginning of our chapter on space and the foundations, Du Châtelet draws a distinction between two highly opposed definitions of space. Oh no. Oh, is that the... There we go. Okay. So she says, some have said space is nothing over and above things. It's a mental abstraction, an ideal being. It is nothing other than the order of things as they coexist, and there's nothing to space except bodies. Others maintain that space is an absolute being, real and distinct from the bodies it contains, that it is an impalpable, penetrable extension, lacking solidity, the universal vessel that receives the bodies that are placed in it. So I think it's tempting to assume that the distinction, so she's opening up with this distinction, right? This is, confessional biography. It's easy to think that what she's got going on here is Newton versus Leibniz. That's to say, it's tempting to assume that the distinction she's working with is between Newtonian substantivalism and Leibnizian relationalism. And supposing that to be the case, it's tempting to assume that Du Châtelet means to embrace Leibnizian relationalism and reject Newtonian substantivalism. And I think that's not all wrong. I do think Du Châtelet sees herself as arguing against Newton, and she does see herself as siding with Leibniz. But I think it's also misleading, because I think the central distinction driving the opening of Du Châtelet's discussion is not really the contrast between Leibnizian relationalism and Newtonian substantivalism, but rather that, in some ways, definitely older, but in some ways deeper distinction between spatial and spaceless metaphysics. So I think the situation is a little more complicated. For Du Châtelet, Leibniz is, incorrectly by our lights, first and foremost a proponent of the spaceless metaphysics, while Newton is first and foremost a representative of spatial metaphysics. While Du Châtelet embraces in the opening sections of her chapter is not really Leibniz's view. And what she rejects is a broader category of metaphysical views that includes Newton's, but also includes other views. I think, all right, so that's what I think is going on. First thing I'm going to do in this first part is I'm going to suggest, once you get what I think is the right frame in mind, we can clear up some of the puzzles that I ran into at the beginning of the chapter. And what I'm going to do is suggest there's five puzzles that we're going to look at. And I think they get a little bit better when you get the right dichotomy in mind. Okay. Okay. So first puzzle. So the first puzzling point occurs immediately in the opening sentence of section 72 of the Foundations. Du Châtelet characterizes the distinction she's tracking as, quote, one of the most famous questions concerning space, a question that, quote, that has divided ancient and modern philosophers alike. In section 73, the next section, she similarly suggests that the division she's working with goes back to Epicurus, Democritus, Leucippus, and runs through Gassendi and Locke. I think that makes perfectly good sense if what she's talking about is the spatial versus spaceless view. That's going to get harder and harder as I go on. But I think, so that is a distinction. That is a point of contention that goes all the way back, indeed, to the ancient atomists. I think it makes less sense that she's thinking about Newton and Leibniz. That debate really only goes back to Newton and Leibniz. It might not go any farther back than the 1680s. So there's that first puzzle. Second puzzle. So the second puzzling point concerns an apparent equivalent formulation she gives of what looks like the Newtonian view. So she starts off by saying, look, what she's rejecting is an impalpable, penetrable extension. That sounds like Newton, fine. But then she says, it is, in a word, a sort of immaterial and infinitely extended fluid in which bodies swim. I think it's very hard to understand that as a characterization of Newton's view, right? We've got like in fact, it's harder to find a less good characterization of Newton's view. Newton's view is like a container and things, and the bodies co-locate with different regions of it. And she's saying, yeah, that's the same thing as like if it's full of liquid, the space is like a liquid in which the things are swimming. I think that's not so odd if she's thinking about the spaceless versus spatial view. The ancient atomists did indeed suggest in some texts that maybe you want to think of space as like a bulky nothing. So that the world's full of bodies and the space stuff, there's two kinds of things. And the bodies sort of move through the bulky nothing, and the bulky nothing does look a lot like, sort of like an immaterial fluid in which these things are moving about. There's a super paper by David Sedley that was the first time I encountered this, maybe a long time ago. I won't tell you how long time ago. But he gives a great example. He says, think of it a little, if you're having a hard time being sympathetic with this, think a little bit about your thermos, your vacuum thermos, when you carry it to work. How do you think about the vacuum in your vacuum thermos? Are you like pushing stuff out of the way so this locates? Or is it sort of like I got a vacuum in my thermos that's sort of like getting carried around with me? Anyway, this is just to say the second puzzle, I find this alternative characterization of the allegedly Newtonian view a bit odd, very odd. If you've got the relationalism versus substantivalism is really what she's on about. But she's on about this other thing, then I think it at least makes pretty good sense. Okay. Third puzzle. This concerns the marginal summary Du Châtelet provides as section 72. There she summarizes the main point of her section. She writes, half the philosophers believed and still believe in empty space, and the other half believed it to be filled with matter. That's her summary of the section. I think that summary is well to the point if she's working with a distinction between the spatial and spaceless views. For the opponents of the spaceless view, we're necessarily committed to the plenum. And the proponents of the spatial view often identify their position in opposition to the spaceless view in defending the void. The summary is less to the point if viewed through the lens of the Newtonian substantialism versus Leibnizian relationalism. I don't want to overstate the case. I don't think it's incoherent. Newton did defend the void, and Leibniz did defend the plenum. So you could tie something in there. But their views on the void and the plenum aren't really tied to their views on space at all, right? The Newtonian view of space is perfectly consistent with the world being a plenum. There's nothing incoherent about that at all. And Leibniz's position on relationalism is perfectly consistent with there being a void. So they're both they're committed on opposite sides of this issue, but not in a way that tracks their views on space at all. So it's not like I think it's incoherent if she's got the one view, but I think it makes a lot better sense if she's thinking of that older view where we really have the views about space really are tied into their views about the plenum and the void. Okay. Fourth puzzle. So the fourth puzzling point concerns the way Du Châtelet draws on the principle of sufficient reason to reject the Newtonian view. I can give you two quick examples. So in section 73, Du Châtelet offers I think an interesting argument to the effect that vacua are inconsistent with the principle of sufficient reason. She says, because if, quote, little atoms or first particles of matter were swimming in the void, their size and shape would be without sufficient reason. For shape limits extension, and the actuality of any shape becomes comprehensible when one can explain how and why extension is limited. So she's saying the principle of sufficient reason means that rules out atoms, because if you had the void, there'd be no sufficient reason why they'd be the shape that they are. Du Châtelet takes this argument to support the conclusion that the principle of sufficient reason banishes the void from the universe. Sorry, I don't know if I missed in section 74, Du Châtelet sketches a familiar Leibnizian shift argument. Like, if you've been reading the Clark correspondence, you're waiting for this to come. It comes. She gives the argument. She rebuts Clark's suggestion that sufficient reason could be just a simple will of God. There's a little familiar back and forth, but Du Châtelet then draws her big conclusion. And her big conclusion is that, quote, one has to conclude that the hypothesis of the void is false, and that there's no such thing in nature. What the two examples are supposed to illustrate is, what does Du Châtelet actually use the principle of sufficient reason for in her view, in her discussion of space? It's at least not what I was expecting. She doesn't use it to argue, she doesn't use it to argue specifically against Newtonian substantivalism. What she does is use it to argue rather against the void, a position that, as I've said, is perfectly consistent with Newton's conception of space. That is, she brings in the big Leibnizian guns of the PSR in her chapter on space, and what does she do with it? She argues against the void, not against substantivalism, or at least not directly against substantivalism. So what she ends up doing is using the big guns of Leibniz to argue against a view that is perfectly consistent with Newtonian substantivalism. Okay, so again, I think this all makes better sense if we see Du Châtelet is working with the spaceless versus spatial dichotomy rather than with the Newtonian versus Leibnizian dichotomy. Okay, finally, fifth puzzle. I need some sense of time here. I have space, no time. I should be done at 4, Ruth?
Sorry?
Should I be done at 4? What time should I be done?
No, not at 4, at 5. At 4 to 5. The
awesome.
ceremony is planned at 5. And
what's that?
We don't get so much chance to ask you if you are making longer. But go ahead.
Oh yeah, no problem.
The only problem is what experience the people now is that in Germany from 6 o'clock on, the heating will be rolled down.
Yeah, okay. So then I don't know if that'll keep you guys awake or make you angry, so I'll try to end on time. All right, so 5th point. In section, and I'm on 18, okay. 5th point concerns Du Châtelet's sustained defense of the plenum in section 76 of the Foundations. So she's going to shift gears in section 77, section 70, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So in section 76, though, she offers, in quick succession, 3 more arguments that she clearly thinks are relevant to the distinction she's drawn in section 72. All 3 arguments are intended to show that motion in a plenum is possible. I'm going to skip the details here. The main point for our purposes is that all 3 arguments would have been familiar to readers at the time as defenses of Cartesian mechanics and cosmology. Du Châtelet's emphasis on the tenability of the plenum, I think, again makes good sense, or at least better sense, if she's defending a spaceless view, essentially committed to the existence, she's defending the spaceless view, essentially committed to the existence of the plenum, not the void, against the spatial view, regularly defined in opposition to the plenum. Anyway, so that's all just to say, I think Du Châtelet's chapter on space makes better sense if we see her coming at the topic with this spaceless versus spatial dichotomy, rather than what we've been trained up for, this distinction between Newtonian substantivalism and Leibnizian relationalism. And with that, we're ready for the 3rd part. Okay. So if what I've said is on the right track, or if you buy that, then by the end of section 76, Du Châtelet takes herself to establish the falsity of Newton's spatial metaphysics, and thus by the logic of the dichotomy she's working with, to establish the truth of her own spaceless metaphysics. In the next 10 sections, Du Châtelet goes on to offer an intriguing, I think highly original air theory for the Newtonian conception of space. It's an account of why we find it natural to believe that space is an ingredient in the world independent of bodies, though that belief, she thinks, is demonstrably false. Du Châtelet's air theory begins with the assumption that we, in fact, have representations of complex things. And by complex things, I think she just means things that have parts. That is, we represent things like birds and bees, trees and ships. She thinks that's puzzling. On the one hand, she thinks when we represent birds and bees, we represent birds and bees as individual things or unities. To do this, I must represent them, she says, as being external to one another. So I think there's like 3 birds in the tree. I think there are 3 distinct things. To do that, she says, they got to be external to one another. Okay, so far so good. On the other hand, she thinks, we represent these complex things as having parts. Right? So I represent there being one tree, but I think it's got roots, a trunk, and branches. So it's got different parts. And to represent those different parts, I have to think those are external to one another. But now I've got like, on the one hand, I'm trying to say there's one tree there, but I'm trying to say there's also roots, trunks, and a branch. And probably, hopefully more than one. So here's the puzzle, I think. How do I manage to represent something complex like a tree or a ship, a bird, or a bee as being simultaneously one thing, as having parts at the same time? How do I represent complex things as being simultaneously one and as being many? Du Châtelet suggests that we are able to represent complex things as both one and many by representing them as being extended. A line is one thing and yet has parts. An extended boat is one thing, but it has a front half and a back half. All right, I have some reservations both about Du Châtelet's puzzle and a proposed solution to it. We can talk about those if you want to. But I'm going to set them aside here because I think at the end of the day, neither really the puzzle nor the solution are all that important for what's going on in the chapter. All she really needs is the very reasonable idea that in representing some complex things, we form an idea of extension. And that idea of extension is very thin in the sense that it has almost no content other than its formal properties. Du Châtelet tells us, once we pay attention to this notion of extension, we see that the parts of extension, when considered abstractly and without taking into account either limits or shapes, do not have to have any internal differences. They must be similar and differ only in number. So extension per se for Du Châtelet has no internally distinguishing features. Its parts are all the same and differ only numerically. And Du Châtelet thinks this is not an accident that our conception of extension is like that. She thinks we make it like that. So here's Du Châtelet. In order to form the idea of extension, we consider only the plurality of things and their union. We exclude every other determination, plurality and unity, and plurality and unity. Anyway, they are only determinations to which we pay attention, and so any 2 parts of extension can differ from each other only in being 2, not 1. I made it. Anyway. All right, so Du Châtelet thinks that our notion of space comes out of our notion of extension. She essentially thinks that our notion of our understanding, our concept of space, comes when we finally strip away all the determinations, all the limitations of our idea of extension. Our idea extension itself is conceived of as uniform, homogeneous, and having not internal determinations that distinguishes one part from another, so that we arrive at the idea of absolute space, which we consider to be homogeneous and indiscernible. Du Châtelet thus thinks that we sort of naturally, maybe even inevitably, arrive at an idea of substantival space in thinking about complex objects in the world. If we have complex objects in the world, we've got to somehow solve the puzzle that she thinks is pressing. To do that, we have extension. Our idea of extension is thinned out. We are the ones that are thinning it out. If we keep thinning it out, we end up with space, this idea of space. And that's totally natural. Right? This is an error theory. Like, why do people believe this? Because, look, everybody's going to be doing this. And then this is the important part. This is an error theory, she thinks. She thinks the idea of absolute space is false. She says, with a little attention, we see that all these alleged properties of space, as well as the being in which we suppose them to exist, have no reality but in the abstractions of our mind, and that nothing like this idea does or can exist. So for Du Châtelet, space is a kind of illusion arrived at by abstracting away from existing particulars. Newton and his followers are guilty of forming the idea of space by abstracting from existing unities and then mistakenly supposing that their abstraction exists independently of the unities from which they have abstracted it. They started with the real things, they form this idea, and then they think, oh, it can exist without those things. Objection. So right there. Is it no reality but in the abstractions of our mind? Wait a minute. Might not Du Châtelet think that space is an abstract idea? That's starting to sound like Leibniz now. Might the process of abstraction not be the creation of idea dependent on unities, but rather a process of discovering, a process of becoming acquainted with something like the Platonic form of space? If that were right, the process would be a little off, but the end game would be maybe not so far from Leibniz. But it's not Du Châtelet's view, though. She grants that abstractions can be useful, but she, in section, she says, but she's clear. I'm sorry, I got the wrong number here. Oh no, section 87. She says, but while abstractions may be useful, they cannot subsist without a concrete thing. That is to say, with a real and determined being from which we are abstracting. Consequently, it is certain that there is space only insofar as there are real and coexisting things. And without these things, there would be no space. So she doesn't want the view that space is an abstract idea in the divine intellect or in Platonic heaven or anywhere else. So I think what's going on in these 10 sections is Du Châtelet's air theory is another route into seeing the falsity of Newton's brand of spatial metaphysics. But not just Newton's brand of spatial metaphysics, of spatial metaphysics more generally. Okay. With that, we're ready for the fourth part. Okay. So I think Newton's most profound contribution to the history of philosophy of space is not in his actual conception of space. There was precedent for that. He's drawing on earlier figures. He's got some really interesting discussions of earlier figures, especially Gassendi and Moore. And maybe he's probably closest to Moore's view. What I think makes Newton a huge deal in the history of philosophy of space is that he takes that view and he tries to bundle it up with his physics. Right? Newton implies that his spatial metaphysics is intimately woven into the most fundamental definitions of his physical theory. So for one especially relevant example to Du Châtelet's discussion, in his opening scholium on the Principia, Newton draws a distinction between relative and absolute place. He argues that that distinction is parasitic upon a distinction between relative and absolute space. And then he argues, then he says, with that distinction between relative and absolute space being itself parasitic upon his spatial metaphysics. That is, on the existence of space understood as an entity independent of bodies. I think Newton, in effect, is saying, look, if you want my physics, you're going to have to accept my metaphysics. Right? That's the big move, right? It's not that he's the first one to think up this conception of space. He says, look, I got the physics, and you know you want it. Then you've got to accept the spatial view that goes with it. And what I think is happening in the last 6 sections of Du Châtelet's discussion of space in the Foundations is I think she's taking her first steps to responding to that sort of indispensability argument that Newton's giving. Right? What she's saying is, and I think it's just a start, but what she's saying is like, look, you don't need space. You can do physics without it. You can even do Newtonian physics without it. Okay. So in section 88, Du Châtelet defines location or place of a being as its determined manner of coexisting with other beings. She says, when we pay attention to the manner in which a table exists in a room with the bed, the chairs, the door, etc., we say that this table has a place, and we say that another being occupies the same place as this table when it obtains the same manner of coexisting with the table that the table had with all the beings. Du Châtelet suggesting that our general notion of location has no need of space understood as an entity distinct from located bodies. The location of a body is determined solely by its relation to other existing bodies. In section 89, she draws a distinction between absolute and relative location. In section 90, she tells us how we determine the location of a being. In sections 91 through 93, she gives definitions of place and situations. Interesting stuff there, interesting details. I'm not the right venue to do that. The main point for our concerns is that Du Châtelet is showing how fundamental concepts of physics may be defined without appealing to space understood as an entity distinct from bodies. She's marching through with saying, look, you can do all this by appeal to bodies, and then I can tell you how you can find them, you can how to define other things in terms of those things. None of this appeals to space. So I think she's effectively rejecting Newton's implied indispensability argument. And that is a next logical piece that you would put in here if that's her what she's up to. Okay, I'm going to close by making two notes. So first, it may be tempting to think that since Du Châtelet rejects spatial metaphysics, she must think that bodies or monads are not spatially related to one another. And then it's tempting to think she must have some sort of very mysterious view, maybe a Kantian picture, according to which the real world is non-spatial, in some puzzling, hard to imagine, maybe impossible to think about sense. And I'm not convinced that that's the right view of Du Châtelet. I've sort of fought this battle for Leibniz once before, so I don't know, maybe I'm coming back. I don't think that Du Châtelet means to deny the bodies are extended, or that they are spatially related to one another. Here I think the association with Descartes might be helpful. So Descartes and Aristotle, for example, also deny that space exists. Right? They think it's nonsense. But I think there's no temptation in the case of Descartes and Aristotle to think that they think, bodies aren't spatially related to one another, or they're not located relative to one another, or that there's some sort of mysterious sort of thing going on. They're saying, look, we've got a plenum. There's no need for space. But there's nothing mysterious or anything like that. On the contrary, they think space itself would be a mysterious, extended nothing something or other. Okay. Second note. So Leibniz also wanted to resist Newton's indispensability argument from physics for substantival space. And I think Leibniz agreed with Du Châtelet that physics doesn't require space. I think the modalities with Leibniz are always a little tricky if you get too fancy about what's possible and what's not possible. But I think really he thinks, look, physics doesn't require the postulation of space of any sort. Certainly not Newton's, but not of any sort. We might then wonder, why does Leibniz embrace spatial metaphysics? Why doesn't Leibniz side with Du Châtelet in the spatial versus spaceless debate? Right? I have him on the spatial side, disagreeing with Newton, but with a spatial view. But now I'm saying, look, Du Châtelet's got this rejection of the indispensability argument. Leibniz buys that argument. He doesn't think space is necessary for physics. So why is he over here instead of together with Du Châtelet? And I think the far too short answer is that although Leibniz is convinced that space is not essential for physics, he nonetheless thought it was indispensable for mathematics. Leibniz was, at the end of the day, to repeat myself, a Christian Platonist. He could not agree with Du Châtelet's suggestion that, quote, the abstract cannot subsist without a concrete thing. That is to say, without a real and determined being from which we are abstracting, unquote. Nor with a related suggestion that, quote, without a multitude of things that we count, there would be no real and existing numbers, unquote. So there's a super interesting project that Leibniz is engaged in from very early on until very late. Gets bundled under what we call now the analysis situs. He's got a big project in geometry going. And I think he thinks space is necessary for that big project in geometry, where the foundations of that is to define a situs. But at any rate, so I think that's the reason he's on the spatial side rather than on Du Châtelet's spaceless side. And I think, worth noting, his reasons for upholding spatial metaphysics then are really reasons that are falling outside the purview of the foundations. The foundations is worried about the foundations of physics. And there, Du Châtelet shouldn't have to worry about Leibniz's worries about geometry. Okay, with that, thank you very much for listening and the time, and I'll look forward to the discussion.